Hello, Player One. Welcome to the Gaming History Club. My name is Gabby.
Hello, and I'm JP. It's only a couple more days and we will all be binge gaming Resident Evil Requiem, I'm pretty certain. But what started the biggest horror franchise in the world? Well, let's find out.
So, before we start, there definitely is a trigger warning for this episode, right?
Well, yeah, 100%. I mean, this is Resident Evil. This isn't some childish little immature 4-6-year-old game. This is some real heavy-hitting stuff, right? Yeah, mostly thematically, because we won't be going into Resident Evil too much. This is how Resident Evil was made and not, the history of all of the games or anything like that.
No. We're not going to talk about all of the Resident Evil plot
No.
from the first game until Village or whatever. You
Yeah.
know, like, no. That's not what we're going to do.
So, without giving away too much right at the start, let's just say what has inspired the first Resident Evil game is also it's a heavy topic. It's about family and death, to sum it up. So, if that's the kind of thing that triggers you, yeah, maybe give this one a skip because we'll be heavily focusing on just that, unfortunately.
Yes, that's true. So, with that out of the way, when was it that you first time playing Resident Evil, JP?
I have no idea. I felt like I've always played Resident Evil.
That's true.
Yeah.
Actually, I did play from PlayStation 1, definitely.
Yeah. I remember that I didn't own Resident Evil as a kid. I mean, I didn't own it anyway. My mother owned the games. I wasn't allowed to own the games, of course. That would have been highly illegal. So ignore that. No, but we did have Silent Hill. We didn't have Resident Evil, but I did still play Resident Evil at other people's places. And I'm pretty sure I played the first one first and very quickly got stuck in, I remember, one of the first rooms in the mansion where there's like 3, 4, 5 zombies in there all at once. So
Oh, not the Jill sandwich then.
not the
No.
Jill sandwich, no. But I did also play the second one a little bit on the PlayStation 1. I think maybe we had it for a little while, but not properly. But yeah, so I would say I did also play from the very beginning. Mind you, I was very, very small at that time still. And I'm same for you, right? I mean,
Yeah, definitely.
this is the mid to late 90s, so we should have probably not been playing those games, to be quite honest.
No, but in all fairness, I'm pretty sure it was more my brother who played it anyway. But yeah, I still remember all of those iconic moments, and yeah, it's great.
Did you prefer the mansion or the police station?
Mansion for me.
The mansion.
I did like the mansion as a kid, and I still like it now. So,
I
Yeah.
kind of like the police station from the second one a little bit more.
oh yeah,
Yeah. Turns out I'm a bit more of a Leon fangirl than a Chris Redfield fanboy.
yeah, that's true. I mean, like I was never a fan of Chris, to be honest, but the
Because
game was
Chris
still
has
cool.
no personality, basically. He's just some hunch jock dude, basically. He's like, football,
And Leon has many.
No, but he's got a cute haircut, doesn't he?
But yeah, anyway, we can talk hours about Leon, I feel like.
Oh, yes.
Which is,
We should have probably just talked about Leon for the first 10 minutes.
yeah, but we're not here to talk about that at all in this episode, unfortunately. But we're going to talk about what makes Resident Evil, and
Yeah.
what happened? How did it
No,
become?
not what happened. That was a few episodes ago.
Okay, or a few episodes in the future, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that's a good question. So, I mean, just in general, before we get into the episode, what for you makes Resident Evil?
Oh, that is a good question. I
It's a
feel
very
like.
difficult question to answer these days, I think,
Yeah.
because now, Resident Evil has created survival horror and it has inspired so many other games, and those in turn have influenced Resident Evil again. And now when you play Resident Evil 7 or Village, it's kind of hard to say what still makes it different now compared to other survival horror games. But I mean, I guess that's just showing how much success it's had creating this genre.
Yeah, and
actually,
the
isn't it?
influence it had for like many other games.
I'll give you
And
2 words that definitely, summarize the old games probably very well. And it's not inventory management. It's actually tank controls.
Is it though?
No, other games also had tank controls, but man, if there's one thing I remember about Resident Evil, it's that it was pretty annoying to have a zombie show up from exactly behind you. But enough of the chit chat then, let's get down to it, let's get serious. What dark forces came together to create Resident Evil, or should we actually be calling it Biohazard instead, Gabby?
No, I know that in Japan it was called Biohazard or known as Biohazard, but I think we should call it Resident Evil. Feels like there's just too many Biohazards already out there. For example, we got a game called Biomenace from 1993, which during production was codenamed Biohazard. It's basically a 2D run and gun shooter from 3D Realms, the guys who made Duke Nukem. And then there's also a band from New York called Biohazard that formed all the way back in 1987, one of the very first bands to mix punk and metal with hip hop. And this is why Capcom didn't even try to get Biohazard trademarked in America. There was just too much Biohazard already at this point. So, you know what? Let's call the game Resi and we'll get to how they come up with the name as well as we go along.
I didn't know there was a Biohazard group from New York that mixed hip hop with metal. That sounds really interesting.
I know, it's a bit before our time, isn't it, to be fair? But yes, really cool.
Most good things turn out to be way before our time. That's why we have a podcast about history.
Yeah, fair.
But don't you think actually it's so... I mean, this is a good reason for why they had to give it a different name in the West, but don't you think it's so annoying when publishers decide, for no good reason at all, that they need to change the name for the foreign audience? One example is Castlevania. So that is actually just called Akumajo Dracula. Like, that literally means Demon Castle Dracula. Is that, like, not cool enough? You know what I mean? Or, like, another example would be Mega Man. Like, Mega Man is just known as Rockman in Japan, which sounds kind of lame. But then again, like, his is called Roll. So it's supposed to be, like, rock and roll. It's supposed to be, like, a funny joke. And
Nice.
that's completely lost to us because he has to be Mega instead of a rock. Like, okay, sure.
Oh, yeah, that would have been cooler, actually.
Mm.
But yeah, to explain what made Resident Evil, we're going to use Resident Evil terms. So the game Resident Evil came together by mixing 3 differently colored herbs.
Yes, or herbs, as I'd like to call them.
Okay.
Yeah. So we have our green herb, and that's Shinji Mikami, also known as the godfather of the survival horror genre, and we'll get into exactly why he is known as that. We got our red herb, Tokuro Fujiwara, and of course our blue herb, which is not a person, but it's actually a movie called Sweet Home. So let's talk about the blue herb first. Let's talk about Sweet Home. So this is a Japanese horror movie that was released back in 1989. And this movie centers around an abandoned mansion.
Yeah, not the Spencer Mansion that we know from Resident Evil 1. No. This is actually called Mamiya Mansion. So in this mansion, a famous artist named Mamiya once lived with his wife and 2-year-old son 30 years before the plot happened. So the movie follows a documentary film crew of 5 people that search through the abandoned Mamiya mansion to find frescoes or wall paintings made by the artist before he passed away. The film crew become trapped and are confronted by supernatural forces, not T-virus zombies, by the way.
No, not T-virus zombies. They actually become confronted by my trigger warning that we discussed earlier. So this is the trigger warning, guys, okay? So it's revealed that 30 years ago, the artist's son actually fell into an incinerator and was burned alive. And this led to the psychological collapse of Lady Mamiya, the mother. She spiraled into madness and delusion, but she begins to kidnap children and burn them in the incinerator. And she is doing this seemingly in an effort to find friends for her son to play with in the afterlife. So yeah, definitely quite a gruesome plot. when the villagers surrounding Mamiya Mansion find out what Lady Mamiya is doing, she also throws herself into the same incinerator that her son and the children she kidnapped died in. And ever since, this mansion is haunted, which I am not surprised it is at this stage, to be quite honest. And 30 years later, the film crew that is looking for these frescoes, these wall paintings from the artist, enter the mansion. And that's basically all we're going to talk about the plot of the movie for. We don't really need to get more deeply into it. That's all you really need to know. If you're wondering how big and successful this movie was, by the way, it was only released in Japan, and it's kind of received like an average review from people at the time. So it's not known as a bad movie, but it's definitely not known as a classic horror movie, right? That's kind of where you can judge it as. So that was The Blue Herb. That's the 1989 Japanese horror movie called Sweet Home. And we'll get back to why this was one of the three key ingredients that made Resident Evil, following a word from our sponsors, Green Herb and Red Herb.
Yes. So, next up, we got our Green Herb, who's widely considered the godfather of the survival horror genre, Shinji Mikami. Mikami was born on August 11th, 1965 in Yamaguchi Prefecture. He had a pretty ordinary childhood, I would say. He wasn't exposed to much video games growing up in the 70s. He played outdoors with his friends mostly and drove his bike around the playground. He did, however, grow up with a violent father. This is quite another trigger warning. He told OneUp.com in an interview from 2010 that he would receive beatings daily. And one night when he went to bed without having done his homework, his father woke him up in the middle of the night and sent him outside in only his pajamas, without shoes, and drove his car to chase his son for 5 or 6 kilometers before turning back home and making Shinji Mikami walk all the way back home.
Wow.
Yeah.
Like, that is something that is going to stick with me. This is something I will always remember, that Shinji Mikami was chased as a little boy by his father in a car for 5 kilometers. Like, that's just, I can't believe it, honestly. That's something else, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so something else to know about Mikami, his primary hobby, as far as I know from the research I've done on him, is horror movies. He was like more into horror movies than video games growing up. So things like Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Evil Dead, those would have been like the big things for him when he was growing up. But of course, video games did have a place in his life too, especially arcade games. So the way he found his way into the industry is actually quite funny. So he was given a flyer by a friend who saw Capcom basically advertising a job fair that was going to be held at the Hilton Hotel. So Mikami actually did play arcade games, and he was playing games like Ghosts and Goblins and 1942, but he wasn't really familiar with Capcom as a company beyond just what arcade games they were making.
Yeah, he actually admitted that he was mostly interested in the free food being served, more than seriously becoming a game developer at that time. You know what? Young me would have agreed.
Yes, this is, like just 100% his type of humor as well.
Yeah.
Like, from what I've seen in his interviews, very chill, very funny guy. This is just completely up his alley. I'm just there for the food.
Yeah. But Capcom did win him over and spark his curiosity in game development. So much so that he would apply for positions not only at Capcom, but also at Nintendo.
Yeah, this is right. So he was even lucky enough to get a interview with both Capcom and Nintendo. But there was a small problem. He was going to have both interviews take place on the same day. So he actually had to choose between either going to Capcom's interview or to Nintendo's interview. And he chose to go with Capcom, which he thinks, in hindsight, was probably the right thing to do because he doesn't think he would have been successful in the end to get hired by Nintendo. He thinks that it would have took Capcom to pick him up.
Yeah, but can you imagine, though, an alternate timeline where the godfather of survival horror actually works at Nintendo? Probably making Luigi's Mansion or something.
Wow, well, I can tell you, Luigi's Mansion, it's already a great game, but it would have definitely been better if Shinji Mikami made Luigi's Mansion.
That would have been funny.
Yeah, so, well, you might now think, oh, okay, so Capcom, well, they just hired him. But you know what? No, not quite. So, we don't actually know why, and Mikami himself also doesn't know why. It's a mystery to him as well. But Capcom actually rejected him at first, but then a week later sent him a letter to say, you're hired as a junior game designer. And this happened around the year 1990. So, yeah, stroke of luck somehow. I don't know what happened there, but like, at first he was rejected, but a week later, no, we definitely want you. Maybe they were talking to a fortune teller about something, who knows?
So it's not really the time to get into explaining what all the different roles in a video game development team, basically. But just to give an idea, as a junior game designer, Mikami really was working his way up from the bottom. Junior designers are usually working with small systems and features inside of a game, like a puzzle mechanic maybe, scripting basic enemy behaviors. In a way, they're far from the artistic mastermind behind games.
Yeah, to grossly summarize it, like you have the video game director, and probably the exact opposite of that role is a junior game designer, basically. So, Capcom seemed to have this strange induction ritual as well, which I found out about researching for this episode. So, they would actually get all of their new employees and put them in a warehouse, and they were just told, you guys need to think really hard about game design. And then they were just left alone for the rest of the day. And this would go on for like months, apparently.
That's crazy. It's a little bit like a prison situation, but hey.
Bit of a boot camp, yeah?
Yeah.
This is crazy. So, anyway, Mikami's first game was a Capcom quiz game, and that only took 3 months to create. But he would go on to work on the design of 3 licensed Disney games. So, that would be Who Framed Roger Rabbit, released in 1991. And then Disney's Goof Troop and Disney's Aladdin, both coming out for the SNES and both releasing in 1993. And especially Disney's Aladdin stood out, and that was a very successful hit for Capcom. And I actually played this game as a kid. It was actually a lot of fun, especially for something where it's like, oh, this is based on like a movie, kind of a thing. It was actually really cool, Aladdin, I remember. So Mikami and his boss and mentor at the time, which is our red herb, Tokuro Fujiwara, he took more notice now of Mikami as well, and Fujiwara would entrust Mikami with more responsibility in his role.
Well, now it's time to talk about our red herb then, if that's the case, the lust of the Dark Triforce that helped to create Resident Evil. So, Tokuro Fujiwara. He was born on April 7th, 1961, so he's only around 4 years older than Mikami. However, he entered the video game industry considerably earlier than Mikami did. Fujiwara had been active since around 1982, so that's 8 years before Mikami would get hired by Capcom.
Yeah, but just because Mikami is known as the godfather of survival horror, that does not mean Fujiwara has been any less influential in the world of video games, because he was notorious for making his video games difficult for the average player. He often went under the alias of Professor F or Arthur King in some of his games, and he had a very strict personality among his peers as well. He is often cited as one of the top game creators of all time.
Yes, definitely, because Fujiwara has been directing, producing, and designing for Capcom ever since the company has been making arcade machines, basically. Just to cite some of his work so you get the idea of how influential he is, some of his notable early works are Ghosts and Goblins, which Mikami even played before joining the video game industry. Fujiwara was also involved in Commando, Bionic Commando, and Strider. Another thing, he was also a main producer for Mega Man. So, as you can see, great lineups there.
Right, so that's our 3 herbs brought together now. We've got the blue herb, the 1989 Japanese horror movie Sweet Home. We've got our green herb, Shinji Mikami, the godfather of survival horror and the poor boy that was chased by his dad in the middle of the night in only his pajamas. our Red Hood Tokuro Fujiwara, one of the main producers behind Mega Man, and Remember Player One for Capcom's 1983 SNES game Aladdin for the SNES, Fujiwara was Mikami's boss and mentor, and Mikami was getting more trust from his Red Hood boss to take on more responsibility.
So the question is, how did Mikami, Fujiwara, and the average horror movie Sweet Home become so important in the history of Resident Evil?
Yes, well, at this point now, the very foundation of what is to become Resident Evil is being made. At some point in the late 80s, Capcom was licensed by Itami Productions to develop and publish a video game to go along with the yet unreleased movie Sweet Home. And they were going to create this game for the Famicom, which is just the Japanese NES.
I feel like they definitely were very confident that the movie would make big time, that they wanted to follow it up with a game already.
Yeah, there's a game tie-in before we even know how good this movie is going to be.
Exactly, yeah. So the game was directed by Fujiwara, and it was one of the first games he made for a console rather than for the arcades. So Fujiwara was invited to the film set and given a tour by the movie's director Kiyoshi Kurosawa. Still, by the way, this is before the film's release. So this was done so Fujiwara could get inspired to create video games around the movie. Fujiwara was given creative freedom in the sense that the director of the movie told Fujiwara that there was no need to follow the plot of the movie exactly. He could expand it however he wants.
Yeah, so when it came to the script for the game, actually, Fujiwara didn't end up changing much of the original plot at all. You know what he did instead, actually? He expanded and elaborated on the original narrative by adding even more details than there was in the original movie. And you know what? This is something that was not actually done in video games before.
Yeah, of course, this was completely new in video games. Most other games struggle to even follow the vague, approximate storylines of the movie that they would be based on. Like if we think about NES games, right? Like X-Men, Batman, RoboCop, or dare I even say E.T.? Do they even have the same plot with the movie?
Yeah.
Vaguely.
And here's Fujiwara with Sweet Home actually going the complete opposite way. He's not just absorbing the complete plot of the movie, he's adding extra stuff in. So the way he did that actually is, which is something that's going to sound really familiar to Resident Evil fans now, is he added a series of collectible diary entries in the game. And these diary entries and other things like talking corpses and hidden messages written in blood actually explain and elaborate how Lady Mamiya, who was suffering from madness and delusion, how she started to lure, kidnap, and kill other children so that her son could have playmates in the afterlife. It expanded on just how that was happening with these diary entries. Really cool stuff.
Yeah, it is really cool. But there are many things that set Sweet Home, the game, apart from other Famicom or NES games. The entire groundwork for the survival horror genre was already being laid out in Sweet Home. And remember, Sweet Home was 7 years before Resident Evil come to life.
Yeah. Fujiwara told the Japanese gaming magazine Continue that he wanted Sweet Home's gameplay to be an interesting mix of unconventional concepts in an attempt to do something that the industry hasn't seen before.
Yes, and what resulted was a unique gameplay blend of Metroidvania-style adventure in terms of how the level exploration and backtracking work, not really on the side-scrolling part, by the way, RPG gameplay elements like the inventory system and combat, and of course, the horror elements inside the game.
Even the gameplay, when you read it like on paper, it sounds very progressive even by today's standards. So the player actually controls 5 heroes, which is the film crew members from the movie, right? And they almost always need to be put into groups of either 3 and 2 people, which that alone by itself already is very unique. And I've not seen a game that does that, to be honest. The characters, themselves, they had special items that gave them unique abilities. So one character, for example, he had a first aid kit and he could cure certain status ailments with that first aid kit. And then another one, he had a lighter and he could burn for like ropes that were blocking the way into other parts of the mansion, for example.
Yes, and the combat happened in random encounters typical for RPGs as well. But instead of loot or gold, enemies would drop story items that would unlock other parts of the mansion instead.
Yeah, also very cool and unique idea at the time. Instead of, walking into a room and there's a key on a table that you pick up for somewhere else, for some reason, your random enemy encounter instead of experience points, like, huh, I got a key? And that was pretty different at the time. Players could be cursed, they could be paralyzed, the mansion has traps that can hurt you, there were strange puzzles that needed strange items to solve. So much of the imagery, the way the game looks, some of the very staples of things like the loading screen doors, statues with fountains of blood around them, that is all things immediately recognizable from the Resident Evil games, but they are actually happening in Sweet Home first. And there's actually so many similarities about just visually how the game looks and works. It's actually just way too much to list, to be honest with you. It's not just the individual things. It's just how many of them all together there is that really make it special. Yeah.
Yeah, including the difficult inventory management, though, which is, of course, a trademark of the survival horror genre. It actually started here in Sweet Home as well. Each character could only carry two items and one weapon, so to progress the story, you'd often need to very consciously create certain groups of characters carrying specific items, because you'd never know what items that you will need depending on your encounters during your exploration.
Absolutely. So that's all for like the gameplay mechanics and how it's similar to what we know from the first few Resident Evil games. But on another level, which is kind of hard to bring across in a podcast, is just how nice the graphic actually is, especially for the NES. When most games, they look like the first Mario, and it's just really pretty. But also not pretty in like a nice sense, but like it looks very appealing. But obviously, yeah, the vibe is very much dread, gruesome, creepy. There's really awesome music in the game to sell everything. But lastly, one thing I do need to really mention as well, the game had a permanent death system too. So if one of your characters die, there's no way of bringing them back to life, right? And this would actually impact the ending of the game. So if you manage to have all of your characters survive until the very end of the game, you would actually get the very best ending from these multiple endings. And this was also a really cool mechanic because if you think about the way the inventory management system worked, it means that if, a couple of your characters die really early in your playthrough, well, that's going to be two people less that can carry items for you, right? And it's just another way the game departed away from the movie, because in the movie, well, two characters died, but you could actually do even better in the game. All of your characters survive in this horror experience.
And I guess no wonder that the game was recognized as being substantially a better product than its source material, the movie, and often cited as one of the lesser known best games ever made for the Famicom.
Yeah, for good reason too. I mean, I never played this game, so when looking at doing this episode, I did obviously have a look, and goodness me, let me tell you, if you haven't played this game, but you really enjoy NES games, this is one game you really, really need to try out. It's really cool. It's basically Final Fantasy mixed with Resident Evil for the NES. Like, how does that not sound amazing, right?
Yes, although it's no surprise that not many people would have probably experienced this game back then, especially in the West, because the West never got to play this game. The game was only released in Japan, never had a translation in the first place. This was presumably because Nintendo thought that the imagery was too gruesome and that RPG games were not popular enough out of Japan, and because Nintendo games had to be licensed by Nintendo, so this was more of Nintendo's decision to never release Sweet Home outside of Japan rather than Capcom's decision.
Yeah, but you know what? This hasn't stopped fan translations being made of Sweet Home. I think especially after people caught on to the fact how much of an influence it had on Resident Evil. So if you have an emulator hanging around, you can definitely play the fan translation of Sweet Home. And you know what? There's even these grey market copies of Sweet Home where people put this fan translation into original NES cartridges so that you could actually experience to play the game as authentically as possible, even though normally you should have never been able to do that. Yeah, so that's pretty cool.
Yeah, so we talk about all of this Sweet Home, and you're probably wondering, what does Sweet Home actually have to do with Resident Evil? We
Oh,
haven't
yeah.
even touched on that.
Oh, this was about Resident Evil? I thought it was about Sweet Home.
We always got sidetracked, but no, it was an important story though. And the answer is actually really simple. Before Resident Evil even had a name, back when it was only known as quote unquote horror game during development, before Resident Evil was even conceived to be a game that was to be made for the PlayStation 1 console, Fujiwara proposed sometimes around 1993 to make a sequel to Sweet Home for the Super Nintendo, where he could do things mainly concerning graphic technology that he wasn't able to do the first time around in the first Sweet Home game.
Yes, and this is where our green herb, Shinji Mikami, who is our relatively new to Capcom video game designer with a love of horror movies, finally enters the scene as well. So, if you remember, he was gaining his trust from his boss and mentor, the director behind the Sweet Home game Fujiwara after Aladdin, right? So, Mikami was now given the opportunity to direct the sequel to Sweet Home. Let me just explain that again. Let me just repeat that. To direct the sequel. Yeah, he was the big guy, the big mastermind behind the sequel to Sweet Home. And he spent the first 6 months developing the game in solitude. He was working by himself, making sketches, designing characters, and writing the script, basically.
But here's where the complication came. Since Capcom didn't actually own the Sweet Home source material, having only had a license to create one game based on a movie and not for any sequels, this project was reimagined to become its own creation instead. And this is how Resident Evil was born.
This is how Resident Evil was born, as a sequel to Sweet Home. So, when looking at Resident Evil through this lens, the influence and impact of Sweet Home is hard to actually not see absolutely everywhere now. So, look at the inventory management, the scattered notes, the diary entries, the puzzles, the very strange puzzles, the emphasis on survival, the loading screen doors, the multiple endings, and just the fact that it takes place inside of a mansion, which, by the way, we did say we would explain why it's called Resident Evil. Well, this is one of the main reasons the marketing team decided to go with Resident Evil, because, well, it takes place inside of a mansion. And yeah, Resident Evil just has Sweet Home written all over it.
Yes, but initially though, it was actually conceived as a fully 3D first person action game. So a prototype was made which had a supernatural psychological horror story to it. So much more similar to the setting of Sweet Home than the Resident Evil that we know now. But development would go a different route altogether. Mikami chose to go with an American zombie horror style film influence instead.
Yeah, and another inspiration was actually the very first 3D horror game that came out in 1992, Alone in the Dark. So Mikami actually saw this game and he started to consider a fixed third-person camera angle instead of his first prototype envisioned as a first-person game. Initially, he didn't really like the idea because he thought that it would take players away from the immersion of being in this horror environment. But what ended up changing his mind actually is that he figured out if he makes this game from this third person camera angle perspective and he ditches the 100% 3D everything, kind of like Silent Hill was, if he uses pre-rendered backdrops instead, he would have a lot of hardware horsepower that he could put into the graphic details of the game, something which he really wanted to do. He wanted this game to be detailed, right? So that's how he ended up settling for this infamous third-person fixed camera angle.
Yeah, and we did say that Mikami was a horror movie buff, and we can totally tell by how Resident Evil is, right? Resident Evil's root in film can be felt, especially with the use of live action sequences for cutscenes, and you can also see the Shining's influence on the design of the Spencer Mansion.
Yeah, so we did say we would talk about how Resident Evil was made and not really about the game and the franchise itself, but
Or the story.
or the story, yeah. But if you want to have us talk about that, please do let us know. We're happy to talk about that. It's got a huge lore and it's really interesting actually, but I had sidetracked. Let's talk about what happened after Resident Evil got released. So let's just start off with it was way more successful than predicted by Capcom. They thought, oh, we'll be lucky if we get around 200,000 copies sold, but it actually sold millions of copies.
Rightly so as well, actually.
Yeah, of
It's
course.
a fantastic game.
You know what? It's actually known as the game that, got the PlayStation 1 sold as well. It was like
Yeah.
the game to get, the game to bother buying a PlayStation.
Yeah, fair enough. If we talk about after Resident Evil and talk about the people behind the first Resident Evil game. So Fujiwara left Capcom after the release of the first Resident Evil to form his own studio, Whoopee Camp. And Capcom also restructured its departments into numbered divisions and promoting some of its games directors as leaders of those divisions.
Yeah, so what does that actually mean in non-corporate speech? Well, let's take, for example, the team behind Resident Evil, right? So they became Capcom Production Studio 4. And Mikami, he was appointed as its general manager. So he went a completely different path now in his career. He was, making Resident Evil as the director, but now being appointed as a general manager, it means he's actually becoming a producer instead. And this is a move that Mikami really regretted because his passion and the very reason he joined Capcom in the first place, in his own words, was to create things and be at the very front of video game development. And he even considered leaving Capcom because of this decision. We did say we wouldn't talk too much about what each video game role does inside of a development studio, but yeah, a producer is not part of creating the video games. They're more like firefighting, like, oh, there's a problem there, like, how do I fix that? And, they're not in the design part of it.
Yeah, definitely less involved in terms of the development process itself. But yeah, regardless, he still oversaw the development of Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3, Code Veronica, Zero, also Dino Crisis, the first and the second one, Devil May Cry, and much more.
Yeah, as a producer, not as a director. But Mikami did finally get back to being at the forefront of video game development when it came time to make Resident Evil 4. But it sounds to me like he was really parted about this because on one hand, like, he did want to actually distance himself away from the Resident Evil franchise because he actually wanted to show Capcom that, listen, you guys can still make these games and they can become very successful without me having to be directly involved as a producer on every single one that we make. But the Resident Evil 4 schedule actually started becoming troubled because of this. And so he had to intervene on a more creative level to make sure they actually make the release date. So that's how he got back to the forefront of video game development. So what he wasn't so happy about, though, is the fact that it was going to be on yet another sequel to the Resident Evil games. He preferred to create something completely new. Honestly, he's like a real creator, creative spirit at heart.
Yes, but Mikami would end up leaving Capcom to pursue ventures with other development studios. So he joined Clover Studios in 2004 and Platinum Games in 2007 before finally committing to making his own development studio, Tango Gameworks, in 2010. Mikami continues to impress the world of gaming with his creative spirit with games like The Evil Within, which we truly love, by the way, and then Ghostwire Tokyo, and Hi-Fi Rush. Truly remarkable games there.
Yeah. So, Player One, with all that, we hope you have a good time with Resident Evil Requiem, and hopefully you learned something new about Resident Evil's deep roots. And be aware, we heard the game and its plot has been leaked, so keep your ears closed on the internet until you finally get to play Requiem yourself.
Yeah, because I bet it's gonna be worth it to just experience it firsthand rather than seeing it elsewhere, basically. But yes, anywho, let us know what topics you'd like to hear next, Player One, as JP mentioned before. If you actually want to hear about more of the plot, more of the story of
More herbs, if you want more herbs.
Yes, more herbs of Resident Evil. Who knows, we can make gaming story club talking about, the plot of video games or something like that. Well, if you're interested in that, please let us know. Write to us on gaminghistory.club. Also, make sure you subscribe and follow us on our social media. We're on Instagram and Facebook as Gaming History Club.
We'll see you next time on the 25th of March with something that is massive, it's multiplayer, and it's RPGs. It's the history of MMORPGs. See ya.